in a pandemic. I'm Steve Pearson, the president and founder of ICER. Thank you very much for joining us. It's just a minute after noon Eastern time, so good afternoon to most of you, or good morning to many of you as well. We're really privileged to have some great speakers today, and to kick off this topic, which we know is of great interest to a lot of different policymakers, certainly to patients, to legislators, to all the different participants in the healthcare system. So it's a real privilege for us to be able to bring together people to talk about pricing in a pandemic from different perspectives. So the session today is going to be on cost recovery pricing, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is shortly. But again, today the panelists include Aaron Kesselheim, who is a professor of medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School; Ronnie Gall, an analyst at Sanford C. Bernstein who covers the life science industry; David Mitchell, the founder of Patients for Affordable Drugs; Randy Burkholder, who's vice president for policy and research at Pharma; and Afton Sissel, who's senior counsel to Congressman Lloyd Doggett, Democrat from Texas. So the way we're going to run this is I'm going to have a very short opening bit. Hopefully I'll do a little bit better than Tony Fauci did with his first pitch last night. And then I'll be handing it over to each of these panelists, who will give approximately a 5-minute kind of perspective on cost recovery pricing. And then we're going to come back together after that for moderated discussion and a chance to address questions that come from the audience. And we have a very large audience. Thank you again for joining. And the way that we've decided to try to handle this is to use the Q&A function in Zoom, not chat. So you will be able to send in a question via the Q&A, and the questions will be curated because we're sure that they're going to be more than we can kind of handle in a kind of single sequence. And we'll try to link some questions up together, for instance, and we'll be able to address that towards the end of the hour-and-a-half session that we have. So as background, again, many of you will know ICER's kind of role, if you will, as an independent kind of research institute. We have done many different reviews of different kinds of healthcare interventions, trying to advance the way that our entire country talks about value, thinks about it, talks about it, and ultimately uses evidence as a way to embed perspective on value throughout the healthcare system to make sure that we are getting good access to care at a price that aligns with value and can be ultimately affordable. So as the COVID-19 pandemic kind of emerged, it fell to us to think, along with everybody else, around what do we think now about issues around pricing, for instance, as a reflection of value, or different ways to price things during the exceptional times that we're all living in now. And this does apply, obviously, to both vaccines and treatments. And we decided to put together a relatively brief white paper that pretty much just lays out the menu of what we viewed were some of the major themes or options, you could call them, that policymakers were going to be debating over the coming months. This is not an exhaustive list, and they're not mutually exclusive, but we wanted to provide something that would give background, a little bit of history, a little bit of definitions maybe, and a beginning kind of view on some of the relative potential advantages and potential disadvantages of different approaches. So that's available on our website, and it includes 6 different options, if you will, or approaches to pricing novel vaccines and treatments in a pandemic. One is the status quo, and again, some people would or would not want to characterize that as unrestricted pricing, but I think we could all take our own judgments on how the status quo works, and certainly we lay out some of what are viewed as the potential advantages and disadvantages of sticking with the status quo as we head into looking at vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. The others briefly are the cost recovery pricing, which is the focus for today's webinar. We'll be having a subsequent webinar next week on value-based pricing, an approach that is often rooted in cost effectiveness analysis. Then we're going to have a third webinar that will cover the last 3, monetary prizes, compulsory licensing, and advanced market commitments. Those are often thought of as more applicable to vaccines, but they can be also applied to new treatments as well. So we'll be covering the full landscape of them, but trying to do a little bit of those three when we come back for the final webinar, the first Friday in August. So today we're going to focus on cost recovery pricing. To view that again in context, just a very brief word about ways to think about the status quo. Again, that does mean that there's a very strong role for private companies to develop vaccines and treatments, and they do get patent rights and basically are allowed to decide how much to charge. Now, that again may seem a little bit too loose because there's always going to be some degree of negotiation with some payer or entity, but largely, certainly in the United States, it has been relatively unrestricted in their ability to determine an initial price. And that allows them to exercise their monopoly for the extent of time that it lasts to kind of manage the pricing as they see fit. So the advantages of this is it's obviously the one that we're used to, and for many people, they would view it as having been successful in making the United States the leading ecosystem for providing innovative products, both vaccines and treatments. It certainly means that everything, again, that we kind of think of as the existing ecosystem or infrastructure is oriented to that as its way to mobilize capital and to bring in the right kinds of incentives to get new treatments going. There's also the view that some people want to advance, which is that insofar as it is quote unquote unrestricted in the US, that produces higher prices than in other countries around the world, and that this may create, in a pandemic, the opportunity to tier pricing in a way that would support very low prices in developing and maybe middle-income countries. Disadvantages, and again, people may reflect on these as they talk about cost recovery as well, because everything to some extent is in comparison to what we're doing today. But there's obviously has been and will be a concern about the possibility that given monopoly pricing and the incentives of any private company and its shareholders, that prices could be set so high that it would create great strain on the ability of the health system to afford it rapidly and equitably to all patients who would need it without either doing short or long-term harm to affordability. So cost recovery pricing, which is the topic for today, again, the term itself is somewhat of a creation, if you will. And people will call this different things. I'm sure we'll hear our panelists want to call it different things because it can reflect it different. It's not kind of one single clear cut concept. Some people would call it nonprofit. Some people might call it other things. But the basic idea is that, again, that still private companies that are developing the treatments and vaccines, they get the patent rights, but there is some function, whether it's by the government or private insurers or manufacturers or commission, any kind of function through which the cost has, if you will, a ceiling set in some way to the cost of development and production of that treatment or vaccine. So it's, if you will, it's the recovery to the manufacturer, to the innovator of the costs of development and production. And within that somewhat very simplified definition, lots of different variations, lots of different terms that need to be discussed, and that's what we're going to do today. Our white paper very briefly points out that among the potential advantages are that this approach is generally viewed as producing a low price, which would maximize the likely affordability to a variety of different governments and other payers. There is the potential that this kind of pricing approach would bring reputational gain to the pharmaceutical industry. I'm sure we'll be talking about that, both as a potential short, again, and long-term strategic potential advantage. The disadvantages, as are commonly cited, include basically how to do it. How do you come up with a single approach or a way to calculate the cost of development of some treatments that might have been in the pipeline for over a decade? around which there might have been various blind ends, kind of failures, if you will, to come to market. How much does that count in the costs? And it may be, in some people's view, that this kind of approach, even if it works for the drug that's right there on the shelf for us, maybe if we need future innovation in this area, maybe this approach provides too low a signal to the market, if you will, to companies, that it is worth their time and investment and risk for other uses compared to other uses that they could put their capital and time to. So that's just a really high level look at cost recovery pricing, and that is why we have many different voices on the call today that we're going to be talking through different issues from different perspectives. So heading into this, I'm going to ask Aaron to go ahead and unmask himself and come on. I will stop the screen sharing. And welcome again, Aaron Kesselheim, Professor of Medicine at Brigham and Women's and Harvard Medical School, who's going to start us off with his reflection on the idea of cost recovery pricing. Aaron?
Thank you very much, Steve, for inviting me and thanks to the other panelists as well. I'm looking forward to an interesting hour and a half. My name is Aaron Kesselheim. I'm an internist and a lawyer, and I run a research group at Brigham and Women's Hospital called the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, which is one of the largest and most prolific research groups in the country that is focused on the pharmaceutical industry. And neither myself nor anybody in our group has any personal financial relationships with any pharmaceutical company. And so I guess I wanted to use my initial 5 minutes just to talk about the cost recovery approach. I think one of the most interesting and important parts of the cost recovery approach is that it recognizes the substantial role that public funding plays in drug development, and particularly during a pandemic. It's well known that public funding plays an important role in the basic and translational research and development through the NIH, which is funds about $36 billion a year for this kind of work. One review run by Fred Ledley and Katerina Cleary out of Bentley University found that all new drugs could be traced back to public funding at some level through this process. I would note that public funding is not reflected in the price of drugs on the market. And as a result, this has led some people to be concerned that patients are then paying twice on the back end for those products. Of course, at some point, traditionally, the information and intellectual property is transferred to a company that might be funded by venture capitalists, might be spun out from a university. Established pharmaceutical companies get involved in although increasingly later in the process. And a lot of these organizations spend a lot of money testing the drug in clinical trials and bringing the drug through regulatory approval and scaling up manufacturing and distribution. I would point out that industry-funded estimates of the cost of drug development, which can range up to $2.6 billion, tend to be an overestimate, I think, in part because a substantial fraction of that is considered to be is considered by the cost of capital of that money. Anyway, we've done a lot of work in our group showing that public funding plays a particularly important role for transformative drugs. The majority of drugs approved in the last 25 years were able to be linked to public funding, often not only in the basic science, but through proof of concept and up until transfer to a commercial entity. And that role is increasing. A recent study that was led by Rahul Nayak in our group was published in BMJ, found that about a quarter of new drugs had a late stage connection to publicly funded science. And I think that it's important to recognize that that these considerations are even more salient in the context of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. And I would point to the billions of dollars that the government is investing in vaccine development, in providing funds to companies like Moderna, with no considerations as part of that transfer relating to the pricing of the product. I would point to the UK government-funded research showing that the drug dexamethasone, which is the only drug right now shown to have an improvement in mortality for patients with severe COVID-19. The government-funded research has helped show that some drugs don't work, like hydroxychloroquine, which has been shown not to work in a number of government-funded studies. And then, of course, there's remdesivir, which was shown to reduce hospitalization time in a trial funded by the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. It was the NIAID trial that was designed in the way to help show the reduction in mortality. The trial that was funded by Gilead at the same time actually wouldn't have been able to show that because it didn't have a placebo arm. So we really have the NIAID trial to thank for our knowledge that remdesivir is useful. Of course, in this case, the price of that drug was then announced basically at the level of the cost of 5 days of hospitalization minus a little bit, so that it can be shown, it could be called a value-based price. But I think that it's unclear whether Gilead, in this case, deserves all of the social surplus that derives from the availability of remdesivir, given again, as we talked about, the substantial investment by government in the case of remdesivir in the testing of the drug for Ebola, the fact that Gilead had already recovered its substantial revenues based on the development of its drugs for hepatitis C, of which remdesivir was initially tested as a drug intended for hepatitis C. Gilead, of course, recovered all of its revenues in investment in that in just 1 year of the hepatitis C drugs that came out. So anyway, I think that leads us back to the cost recovery pricing model, which I think would allow for a fair recovery on investments, fair profits for investments by commercial entities, and fair, I think, should also be considered to be taken into account with the emergency situation. And I think it would maximize access to the drug for the community in a world that is right now struggling under a pandemic. So I think that's the end of my 5 minutes, and I'm looking forward to the conversations and Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Aaron has the best bow tie in the business, in case you hadn't done before. Thanks very much. Okay, Ronnie. So cost recovery comes down as a mandate tomorrow morning. What happens on Wall Street? What happens? What should happen with this idea? How might your side of the world, your perspective on this? What do we have to learn?
So I'm guessing nothing actually, but if it's an exception. But let's go through this in organized fashion. So first, I want to thank ICER for taking the lead in having this important conversation. And second, just a quick word of where I'm coming from. I'm an analyst on Wall Street, and I would say the majority of us on Wall Street, see a healthy and profitable biopharma industry as something that we'd like to see, and obviously is important for the country. But I have no interest in companies over-earning on COVID-19 on a short-term basis. And obviously, as informed taxpayers, probably a little bit more informed than most, myself and most of us at Wall Street are pretty much offended by past price gouging strategies of any kind, including the drug industry. I would also say, as a kind of a personal opinion, so you kind of know where I'm coming from, that I think it's completely reasonable for the U.S. To receive the same prices for COVID-19 therapies and vaccine as the rest of the developed world. The U.S. showed some leadership in paying up front and taking some risk in the developments of those therapies. And, given that they're not being charged in terrible prices, it makes sense for us to get the same prices everyone else does. So with that, let's look at what kind of the solution being discussed here. ICER definition of cost recovery approach for COVID-19 in the white paper basically said we should calculate the marginal cost of producing kind of like the next cost of therapy. We should pay for some sort of a direct research and development associated with the final development stage of the drug specifically for COVID-19. From that, we should subtract whatever the government paid for that final sprint to get the drug approved. We should explicitly exclude all pre-COVID-19 investment in R&D and capital expenses, which obviously are being used here as a basis for the development that we have seen in the past few months. And then we should add some sort of a reasonable profit margin beyond this marginal cost. And the argument appears to be that for that cost-based approach, the way I understand it at least, is that we already are paying handsomely to the drug industry for their business day to day. And as Aaron pointed, the US is contributing quite materially for that final sprint to develop those drugs and vaccines. And therefore, the drug industry should do this as a free, essentially. So here are kind of like some of my thoughts on this. So first, I'm not quite sure we really have a problem here that requires us to think about an acceptance solution. Now, several companies have noted that they will provide, especially the vaccine at cost. Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca said that they will do it during kind of like the acute phase of the pandemic. Pfizer, who did not take any government money specifically to stay free of those kind of stipulation, have priced their drug at roughly $39 for a course of therapy of 2 treatments. And that should be the higher price point because they have not taken any federal money. If you assume 300 million people in the United States, that comes to about $12 billion. If we assume that we will double that for other therapies being used for people already sick or being exposed, then we get to about 24 billions, which, obviously seems to, at least to me, like a pretty good value given we're talking about throwing multiple trillion-dollar save the economy payments to various bodies. And kind of we're talking about a vaccine which could eradicate the disease for a year. So it seems like it does not seem like we've got a huge problem here. And frankly, even if you compare that $24 billion or so to the average annual cost of therapy for drug therapy in general, which is about $300 to $400 million across all the drugs that we use, we're not talking here about a big sum of money. Now, also remember that post the acute phase of the disease, call it a year or so out, that we're looking at something like 8 to 10 vaccine makers, which are going to be in development and potentially launching the drugs before the end of 2021. And thus, if you kind of think about the post-acute period, we're probably going to be in a position where we'll have an abundant vaccines to choose from. And thus, in trying to create some sort of a special mechanism just for that, it does not make sense to me. So are we kind of like look at a hammer looking for a nail? And to some extent, it feels that this is the case here. Second point is that if we do apply the cost plus model, we will get lower costs. I mean, there's no question about that. I think ICER kind of pointed them. Remdesivir costs probably about $10 to manufacture full course of therapy versus the roughly $2,400 being charged. Vaccines at scale are probably manufactured for under $10 per dose versus a $39 being suggested as a price for Pfizer. And last, antibodies. We don't know what the final antibody doses would be, but they will probably be around 1 gram plus minus 2x per course of therapy. And that should cost under $100 or at most under $200. And if we look at the price suggested by the Regeneron initial contract with BARDA, the assumption is it's around $2,500. So yeah, we could get the drugs for cheaper if we absolutely want it that way, if we apply that model. So, I would take a few issues to this exception pricing for COVID-19 approach. The first one is this argument that we should not consider the previous investment and we should assume the industry have earned enough. This might work for the larger companies, but it doesn't work for the smaller companies. So if you kind of look at the smaller companies who have essentially shifted the business model to focus on COVID-19, people like Moderna, BioNTech, and Vir, if you look what those companies have done for the last month or two, they've raised billions of dollars from the investing public. And if we had a cost-plus model in place, I'm reasonably sure that they will not be able to raise that money, and their path to the market will be a lot tougher. So we would argue that we will not have the same level of innovation for COVID-19 specifically if we adopted some sort of a price restrictive model. Second, even for larger companies, we have seen a very large shift in capacity and capabilities from current business to COVID-19. And even within those companies, I don't believe we'll get the same kind of investment and attention if we have seen some sort of a cap on the ability to profit from this initiative. And last, again, and that was already mentioned, is we are looking for continuous innovation here. The first generation of vaccine are being developed very, very quickly. Hopefully for us, they'll be good enough, but they will probably not be the best vaccine. We want vaccines that are extremely safe, give you vaccination for multiple years, and are relatively easy to take in terms of course of therapy and immediate discomfort. So if we want continuous cycle of innovation, it seems that we kind of want to incentivize ongoing development of an innovation here, as opposed to simply saying that's how much you make and probably get stuck with the first generation drug. And then if we kind of think about cost recovery approach longer term, the idea does address some important abuses, and I can see why this is coming around. it will address issues like evergreening, things like the patent thicket efforts being made right now, simply because you can say, look, this is how much you're making if you have a longer patent life because you found a way around the current patent system, we're going to pay you less. It does address this issue of marginal improvement at full price. Essentially, people do things like twice-a-day drug versus once-a-day drug and charge full price even after the first generation drug patent expires. And it does solve the problem of large companies purchasing small companies at a very high premium and then having to price the drug at a very high price in order to recover their initial investment. And the hepatitis C example that Aaron referred to is an example of this. So the logic here that says, look, we need to incentivize you, but not over-incentivize you makes sense to me. However, if you look at the cost recovery model, it has huge problem long-term. First, the drug industry cost of manufacturing is under 10% of the overall drugs. In 90%, or I should probably call it 50, 60% of the cost of the drugs is SG&A and R&D. And immediately you lend yourself to a gaming when people try to optimize their cost structure in order to drive that, in order to maximize the price. Second, we use risk and the cost in the drug industry, and it's very hard to account for the risk in this model. And then Peter has just sent me an email that I better wrap up, so I will quickly mention. In the end of the day, a cost recovery model would invest an enormous power in a bureaucracy that will have to decide what fair pricing is. And even if best intentions, even if we believe those people are making a real effort, it's really hard to see this being a good solution that will give us a healthy drug pipeline in the long term. So in the end of the day, I would say cost recovery model is very good at identifying the problem. I'm not so sure it's the right solution. And I'll move it back to Steve.
Thanks, Ronnie. That's great. Just a really quick point, because I didn't mention before that our report on remdesivir did include some kind of a model, if you will, a kind of a way to think about cost recovery. We were relatively agnostic because we wanted it to be clear that people would make different judgments about what to do with the federal investment piece. Should that be subtracted? Should it be not subtracted? We didn't make a full judgment on that. And similarly, and I'm sure this will come up later too, we could identify, at least by the company's projected claim, how much money would be spent on the research specific to COVID-19. Estimates of how much had been spent prior on the development of remdesivir were just really not available from any source. So it was kind of easy for us to say, we're not sure what would be done with that, but we don't know what it was anyway. So we'll be talking more about how that's part of the problem that some people will raise about cost recovery, is even if you want to go back in time and find that, it gets pretty slippery when you try to get it.
Exceedingly slippery.
So we'll talk about the practicalities too. But on to David Mitchell. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll let you jump in now with your view on cost recovery and the view from your side of the patient advocacy spectrum, and other things that you think that we should be paying attention to as we think through this particular paradigm of pricing.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to the other panelists for joining today. Before I begin, I would like to say I have an incurable blood cancer that compromises my immune system, and the 4 chemo drugs they have me on right now make that worse. So finding effective treatments and vaccines for COVID-19 is pretty important to me. Right now, my family is treating me like I need to be hermetically sealed. And I'd kind of like to have this period of my life behind me. And so would a lot of other people I know. But to the matter at hand, I want to start by saying that cost recovery is a misnomer from our perspective. We believe drug makers should not just recover their costs, they should make a profit on coronavirus treatments and vaccines, a fair profit. Now the question then is, what is a fair profit? Hang on a minute, and I have just managed to move myself away from, there we are. So what is a fair profit? And we have to ask that question, especially in light of the global health emergency we're in, when the public and private financial sectors are under enormous stress. For us, the starting point to answering that question for the seller and the purchaser is, how much did it cost to develop and make it? We can use remdesivir as an example. We know some things about the answers to the questions. A peer-reviewed study that others have referenced reported cost of goods for a course of treatment at about $10, which is not out of line for pharmaceutical products, similar ones. Gilead claims it's investing $1 billion on development and manufacturing of remdesivir. And we know that taxpayers paid for the key clinical trial that Aaron referenced that rescued remdesivir from the storage shelf. Taxpayers have invested altogether somewhere between $70 and $99 million directly on remdesivir. But we really don't have the key piece of information necessary to make sure we set a fair price and a fair profit for patients and taxpayers and Gilead. Only Gilead has the actual cost to develop and make the drug. If we knew what it was, we could have an open and transparent discussion about fair price and profit that would be very important in this setting of a pandemic. We did a rough analysis based on what we do know from analysts like Ronnie and others to try and determine how much money Gilead stands to make on remdesivir at the prices it has set. We used a blend of CDC and World Health Organization patient projections. We used analyst projections, pricing at $30,120 for most of the US and $23.40 in other developed nations. We accepted Gilead's claim of $1 billion investment, even though we think that is quite high. And then we tripled the cost of goods that was reported in the Journal of Virus Eradication that we have been referring to, all of us. When we use this publicly available data and make very conservative judgments and projections, we think at Gilead's current pricing, it will achieve a profit of more than 80%. That's more than double its already healthy profit over the past 3 years of 36.8% annually. Now, to us, that much profit is the very definition of profiteering on a pandemic. So our analysis was done by a fellow cancer patient who was a pharma CEO and has 30 years of experience in the industry. We'd be happy to share his calculations and have Gilead show us where we are wrong, but that's the whole point. If we could have a transparent discussion of verifiable costs, we could negotiate to arrive at a fair return. Might it be less than 80% profit, especially under the circumstances? Well, we think so. In fact, we calculate that at a 20% profit, which is roughly where the industry claims is kind of its average profit, total industry profit, the price of a course of remdesivir would be $628. If we credited taxpayers for their investment, which is about 10% of Gilead's claimed $1 billion, we could reduce the price by another $63 to $565. The point is, in a health emergency, in a moment when taxpayers are pouring billions of dollars into treatments and vaccines, now is the moment to actually have transparent and open negotiations. When we have those negotiations, we can also consider factors like the risk that was taken and the value provided with upper bounds for global budget impact. And global budget impact is a very important point always, but especially now. We cannot be sending unlimited dollars to drug companies at a time when millions of people are struggling and governments are pressed to meet so many immediate needs. If we had unlimited resources, we could pay drug companies whatever they want, but we don't. And every dollar in unwarranted profit we give pharma is a dollar we don't have for uncompensated care, for unemployment benefits, for food stamps, or accommodations to make our schools safe to reopen, or so many other urgent needs. A pandemic emergency is not a time to maximize profit. We need a fair price, including a fair profit, but that discussion cannot happen without transparency and open good faith negotiations that taxpayers and everyone can see.
Thank you very much, David. Much appreciated. And sorry you have to stay hermetically sealed. It's been far too long since the world has been able to shake your hand. Randy, I'm going to come over to you, obviously. I know that you've got comments made, but obviously people have made reference to the idea that Johnson & Johnson and at least a couple others have talked about some kind of nonprofit phase. And I think that's been more talked about in terms of vaccines than other treatments. But your reflection more broadly from your perspective on on cost recovery as a paradigm, as a way of thinking about pricing, particularly in a pandemic.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I will speak to that in just a minute. I think cost recovery has some particular flaws, and Ronnie was alluding to some of them that make it particularly ill-suited to application in the time of a pandemic. But I want to stop back, and Steve, maybe I'll start just by quibbling a little bit with your framing for the discussion around status quo versus several alternatives like cost recovery. Because I think there is another scenario that is maybe the most likely one, I would argue, and that is that we by definition are not in the status quo right now. We're in the middle of a once-in-a-generation public health crisis. So the other potential scenario is that we're not in the status quo, but we're in an environment where every stakeholder in healthcare recognizes that this is a unique moment, appreciates what's required of them, and responds accordingly. And I think that is where the biopharmaceutical research sector is right now, both in our commitment to rapidly bringing safe and effective new treatments and vaccines forward as quickly as possible, but also in our commitment to affordability. So I think another potential scenario is that we all recognize what is required in this unique moment. We pull together and we get through this. But to that initial point, I do want to start with just recognizing the fact that this conversation is relevant right now because we can foresee a not too distant future, I hope, where we do have new, more effective treatments and vaccines available. And that will present this very relevant issue of affordability. But I did want to say at the outset that we are, of course, as biopharmaceutical research companies, in a all-out, round-the-clock effort to discover and develop those new effective treatments and vaccines. And right now, we do have several hundred clinical trials underway for potential COVID-19 treatments, as well as dozens of trials for vaccines. And that includes, of course, several late-stage phase 3 studies. As Ronnie alluded to, this work is really uncertain, really challenging. Most of those trials probably will not pan out. But we certainly are hopeful that some of them will, and that we'll have new treatments and vaccines approved for use in the not too distant future. Our mission as a sector is one that is focused at its core on serving the public health and the public good at the end of the day. So we as a sector are doing all we can to step up and help meet this unique public health challenge right now. So that includes the considerable donations of materials and expertise that we are making available when and where they're needed most. Not only major financial contributions to COVID response efforts, but also donations of current treatments, surgical supplies, and protective equipment. We're also engaging in unprecedented collaborations. Some of that was already alluded to in the clinical trial space, but with public health officials in the US and around the world, but also with partners in the private sector so that we can combat COVID-19 as quickly and as effectively as possible. As part of this collaboration, for example, we are sharing our learnings from clinical trials in real time with governments and with other companies so that we can advance development of additional therapies. And we are also going to share our capacity to ramp up production once we hope successful medicines or vaccines are developed. So a lot of companies that are in clinical trials right now are spending billions of dollars to build manufacturing capacity for those new treatments and vaccines, even though they're still in clinical trials. They're doing that so that we can make sure that if a particular product is successful, that we'll be able to produce it at scale as rapidly as possible. Of course, many of those companies will likely never recoup much of that cost because most of those trials are going to fail. Our companies, and that underscores that we are taking substantial financial risk every time we launch research and development of a potential new treatment or vaccine. The vast majority of these aren't going to be successful. Again, we certainly hope that a few will. I would note that one of the things that enables us to launch the rapid and concerted effort we have is that in the US, we have a competitive market-based healthcare system that enables us to take these risks and refocus very quickly and adapt very quickly to this new challenge as it emerges and to start putting some shots on goal against COVID-19. So it's important for us to maintain and strengthen that system so that we are also ready for the next pandemic. So looking at something like a cost recovery tool it's important to consider, as Ronnie was indicating, whether or how well they account for the many R&D failures, both in an individual company, but across the sector, that will always come before there's any particular R&D success. Speaking of the issue of affordability, our sector recognizes that the unique moment we're in requires a commitment to affordability. And I am very confident in saying that our companies are fully committed to ensuring that when and if effective new treatments and vaccines are developed, that they will be accessible and available to everyone who needs them, not only in the US, but around the world. I have every confidence that our companies are going to make good on that commitment. And I think there's good reason for us all to have that confidence when you look at statements that are coming out from public officials like Dr. Fauci, but also when you look at the steps that companies already are taking to make good on that commitment. I think we have every reason for confidence that we'll get through this in a way that assures affordability at the patient level and at the system and taxpayer level. Remdesivir has been brought up a couple times. I'm going to maybe take an extra minute just to speak to that very briefly, because I think remdesivir really is a great exhibit and leading edge example of a company that did work rapidly to bring a novel COVID-19 treatment to patients quickly in a way that is benefiting them and benefiting the healthcare system, but also doing it in a way that reflects their commitment to affordability. So as Aaron noted, data does show that median recovery time for remdesivir is 4 days shorter on average for patients with COVID-19. So at its current price, it's going to more than pay for itself just in reduced hospitalization costs. Now, it's obviously also improving patient outcomes as it does that. And I believe Gilead has published data showing that it has a positive impact on not only recovery time, but mortality. Last thing I would say about it is even looking at ICER's models, which I believe, Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they didn't consider those shorter hospital stays, certainly didn't account for the broader societal benefits that an improved treatment is going to deliver. Even based on ICER's model, remdesivir is priced well within the recommended range of cost effectiveness. So I think it's a great example of companies stepping up, taking risks, making an effective treatment available, and delivering on affordability. So I guess in sum, I think we will continue to see more of that. I don't think I have time to speak to some of what's emerging in the vaccine space, but I think we'll probably get to that. But I'm very confident that a year from now, we'll be able to get back together and we'll be able to see that companies have stepped up, have met their commitment on affordability. And my hope is that as a result, we will have earned more of your trust. Now, I'll speak briefly and wrap up, but I did want to speak briefly to the issue of cost recovery and thinking about research and evidence and tools that we will use to evaluate that evidence on new treatments and vaccines. The first thing I would want to say in that regard is that I think for us to finish the fight against COVID-19, we're also going to need a shared commitment to ongoing research and to better data, even after new treatments and vaccines are introduced. This is an incredibly dynamic and evolving space, and that continued development of better research and data is going to be incredibly important. And our companies are as committed to that continued research as they are to affordability. And look, if there's one thing I think we've learned over the past 6 months, it's that a research model is only good as the assumptions it's built on, and only as good as the data that can feed into it. So I think at the end of the day, that shared commitment to continued research so that we can better understand the role and value of new treatments and vaccines, that is going to matter more than reliance on any single one metric or framework. So that said, and the last thing I wanted to say briefly was that, I think tools for evaluating and summarizing available evidence and getting it in front of decision makers is going to have an important role to play. So I think the discussion that ICER is kicking off today is important. I also do think it underscores that the metrics and frameworks that we have right now aren't yet up to the task in the middle of a pandemic, that we've all got work to do. I think the cost recovery model is a case in point of that. Ronnie, you spoke, I think, pretty eloquently of that. I won't go into detail on it, but I think what I've seen so far is that those models aren't well grounded enough in scientific evidence. They're not validated enough, but also that they have generally been pretty soundly rejected by health authorities around the globe. So I think they have some particular flaws that make them a particularly bad choice during a pandemic. So we undoubtedly need better methods and better frameworks. I'm really proud that our sector is making an unprecedented level of investment and better methods and frameworks. And again, I commend ICER for spurring this important conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. I'm not doing a lot of formal checks on statements at this stage, but I do, partly because it's easy to lose some of the detail around remdesivir real quickly before Afton starts. Because actually Aaron stated as well, interestingly, the data so far that's publicly available has not looked at hospitalization length of stay. It's only been time to improvement, and it's not known how much, if at all, that does shorten length of stay. So it's easy to get the two kind of, it would seem likely, one would think that if you're getting better quicker, but some people have actually said that patients are staying longer in the hospital to complete their course of remdesivir than they would have otherwise. So we're hearing anecdotal from both sides, and we're waiting to see hopefully that there will be data on that specific element later. While the mortality is also still not a statistical finding, the ICER model, as many of you know, did take that into assumption as our base case, but we provided another scenario analysis in which the mortality was not assumed. So if you want to really hear more about that, you can tune in next week. But we're sticking with cost recovery. It's a pleasure to welcome Afton Sissel, who again is Senior Counsel to Representative Doggett. And Afton, thank you very much. What's the perspective that you're looking at these issues from?
Sure, thank you, Steve, and thanks to you and the rest of the ICER team for having me here this afternoon with this great panel. So before I discuss my thoughts on a cost recovery model, I first want to push back on the framing of this conversation, as well as a little bit about what Randy was saying about whether we're currently in the status quo or not, and whether we should even be talking about pricing during a pandemic versus other situations. The general consensus seems to be that because we're in the midst of a serious health crisis, the standard model for drug development, exclusivity, and pricing may not work for this specific situation. It may lead to some being priced out of access. Manufacturers may decide it's not worth the risk because vaccines are difficult to develop and they're not always lucrative. And given the great demand, exclusive rights will mean that no single manufacturer can quickly meet the supply needs for the globe. All of these things are true, but they're not unique to a pandemic or to this particular moment. There are thousands of health crises, and the current model isn't working for any of these patients. I think if you were to ask David whether cancer is a health crisis, he would agree with me that it is. If you were to ask Nicole Smith-Holt, whose son died after rationing his unaffordable insulin, whether diabetes is a health crisis, she would say yes. If you were to ask a patient with multiple sclerosis whether MS is a health crisis, they would say yes. The current system is not working for any of these patients. Abuse of monopoly rights and price gouging are never appropriate, regardless of whether the disease at hand impacts the entire globe or not. With that being said, I am strongly supportive of a cost recovery model that ensures pharmaceutical companies recoup their investment and some reasonable profit, as David mentioned. Let's put an extra emphasis on reasonable. Multiple studies have found that pharmaceutical companies have significantly greater earnings than other large companies. One study showing that 35 large pharmaceutical companies had median profits that were nearly double those of 357 large non-pharma companies. So I think in addition to determining and assuring that we have a reasonable profit, there are several issues that we need to discuss when discovering a cost recovery model. We must first define what the development costs are. For example, I would not consider marketing expenses or physician education expenses to be development costs. We must also determine whether to weigh development costs differently. Do certain types of research receive a greater value within the formula? Does it matter whether the funds came directly from the pharmaceutical company or another source such as the federal government? When taxpayers are underwriting the risk, such as right now, their investment should be accounted for. And to ensure that any final calculation is accurate and has the public trust, we must see the balance sheets. A cost recovery model does not work in the current opaque system. We must have full transparency on how many dollars are spent, where they came from, and precisely where they went. Congressman Doggett recently introduced bipartisan legislation to provide this transparency for the billions of taxpayer dollars that are being expended for COVID vaccines and treatments. The TRACK Act would allow the public to know where their monies are going, the terms of the agreements, whether the government has any patent ownership in the drug, and any tax benefits the company is receiving from the R&D credits or charitable deductions, such as the one made earlier this year by Gilead. Once we have defined the costs and provided the transparency to verify them, we must determine what timeline is appropriate for the cost to be recouped. Gilead is set to recoup its entire investment just from the US purchase of remdesivir through September. Every purchase after that is profit on a drug that has been outrageously priced given the significant public investment in its development, the low expense of manufacturing it, and the modest benefit that it offers. The initial price sets the stage for all future negotiations, and it is rare these days that a price is lowered. We just see them rise year after year. A cost recovery model cannot lead to a price that recovers the cost immediately and then never reduces the price after. A true cost recovery model means a company never profits beyond a predetermined reasonable threshold. The current no profit pledges that some companies are making would be limited to the duration of the emergency, a fluid concept that they could arbitrarily decide has ended when they see that money is on the table. This is not a genuine cost recovery model. To sum it up, I would say we all want a successful COVID vaccine and the miracle drugs to cure the many diseases that plague the world right now. But an unaffordable drug is completely ineffective, and for too long that has been the status quo. I'm hopeful that this series of discussions that ICER is holding right now will help spur the movement for reform.
Thank you. That's just lovely. Thanks to all you guys. All right, why don't you now unmask everybody? And I will stop sharing my slide. Actually, I think we're fine. Yeah, good. So everybody can be seen now. Again, please continue to send in questions among the audience members. Please feel free to continue to send in questions through the Q&A button as part of the Zoom call. We will start to curate those and start to feed them up to the panel members. So I bet each single one of you has something you'd love to say back to the other one, or a question you'd like to ask to somebody else. So start to think about that as well, because it's not just going to be me asking questions. But I will start because among the different elements of a cost recovery approach, again, there's both kind of a conceptual approach and there's a practical set of questions. David, you're one of the first people that I've heard say that you can see a fair profit when you see one because it's a percent profit, I assume, on the cost of the production, not on the embedded costs of research passed through 10 years. But I wanted to just get you to state again your view of that percent approach to a fair profit. Because a lot of people say cost recovery is cost of production and quote unquote fair profit. And that's where they stop. You go on to say they make 20% overall as an industry, so it should be 20% on this one drug or something to that effect. Can you say a little bit more on that? And then I'm going to ask Ronnie what Wall Street thinks of that as a fair profit. How does it compare to their way of thinking of it?
Well, I wanted to ask Ronnie and Randy that question. Yesterday, one of Ronnie's colleagues was talking about the Pfizer vaccine and saying that Pfizer would realize at one dose $15 billion in revenue, but more importantly, a profit of between 60 and 80%. Now, in any world I've lived in for my 70 years, 60 to 80% profit would be by definition profiteering. It just takes my breath away. And if it is a time, as Randy says, I agree with Randy on this point, that the industry should be showing responsibility and understanding that this is not a time to maximize profit. This is a time to maximize public health and make sure that we provide a fair profit for companies. And I said, too, that we should take into account risk and we should take into account value. A vaccine that produces, a 50% effectiveness rate shouldn't be priced the same way as one that produces an 80% effectiveness rate. But I just want to know, am I living in another parallel universe that thinks 60 to 80% profit is slightly too much?
Ronnie, why don't we let you answer that first, and then Randy, if you have a comment.
Throwing me to the wolves. I see. So
By the way, it wasn't you, Ronnie. It was one of your colleagues.
No, I'm saying this. I'm saying this. Being the first one to take it on. So first, let's get a few facts here. So first, you kind of mentioned, I don't know what $15 billion come from, but kind of thought the industry will make, say up to $24 billion overall from this. And frankly, versus our healthcare cost, it's really not much. Okay. Second, you really do not, if you want to keep drug costs low, especially for vaccine, you really do not want to talk about value. Vaccine are about the highest value drugs the high values of anything we have. You are going to pay $40, presumably, which for the opportunity not to have with high level of certainty, or hopefully high level of certainty, an infection for several years. If we think about the cost of treating one patient, or even the cost that I personally am incurring in alcohol consumption because I cannot leave my apartment, I will probably justify that $40 any day of the week. So to kind of be a little serious, in terms of value, there's no question that the treatment for COVID-19, in the prices being discussed so far, are going to be in the high end of what we should be expecting the drug industry to deliver. So I would immediately argue that, if you look at that metrics, the drug industry is doing great. In terms of the profit that you mentioned of 60 to 80%, the question is how you measure profit. So on a marginal basis, 60 to 8% is not high. Most of the drug industry cost of manufacturing is roughly 5% to 10% of the cost of the drugs. The issue is that those 5 to 10%, that the drugs lose their patent protection after, call it 20 years from invention, typically 7 to 12 years from the date they come to market. And presumably those drug companies are spending that money, one, developing the next generation of drugs, and second, doing what's referred to as G&A. Efron argue that this should not be accounted for. I hear it's less valuable than R&D, but if doctors don't know about the drugs and patients are not educated about asking for it, you'll see those drugs being a lot less efficient. So you cannot isolate one element of a company and say, well, that's the only element that creates value. That's actually not the case. So I don't know if I answer your question, but I'm kind of worried about demagoguing the issue. Okay, we've got a real issue here, and it's easy to throw out statements like how much money are they making, but in terms of solution for long-term good drug industry, we want to be a little bit careful and just throwing rocks. That's my only point here. That's all.
I do have to take exception to that, Ronnie. I don't think asking what is a fair profit is demagoguing an issue. I think it's going directly at the issue of we're in a pandemic. You're, for example, talking about all the risk these companies take and how they're going to plow the money back into research. But the fact is the federal government has already kicked in more than $5 billion, not to Pfizer, I know, but to other companies for this. So we're underwriting the risk. And when someone, I think it was Randy, talked about these companies who are going to start manufacturing, standing up manufacturing capability in manufacturing before a drug is approved, we're paying for that. Taxpayers are paying for that. These questions, to put them off as me demagoguing an issue when I'm raising legitimate questions about where's the money coming from, who's making the investment, who's taking the risk, and what is an appropriate return, those seem to me appropriate questions for patients and taxpayers and every American to ask of this industry, especially in this time of pandemic.
Let me step in just for a sec and acknowledge that the reason we wanted to have this kind of colloquium is because there are such strong issues and strong feelings about the issues. So we're going to definitely not avoid those on this call today. That's a healthy thing. I was asking my question partly because seeking a solution to the question of what a fair profit is at the heart of many of these debates. And so, David, your approach of a percent, I just wasn't sure whether, because I hear Wall Street mainly talking about absolute numbers of revenue and whether it will add to their, whatever their revenue line is that year. I mean, they talk about profit in a different way. And so a percent fair profit, I was just kind of curious if that language translated through to a Wall Street set of ears in a different way, or if you reflected it the other way around. If Wall Street were to say, what's a fair profit? based on a cost recovery plus some profit approach. Ronnie, what would, I know you're not Wall Street, you say you yourself, but is there, if it's not, if it's not a percent on, if it's not a percent on the cost of the production, if you will, what does the word fair profit, does that even, I mean, does it sound like Klingon or some other completely alien language on Wall Street? What's the formula?
Yeah, I think the basic view is it is whatever the buyer is willing to pay for it, right? Is the starting point of the definition. But no, I would argue that we typically think about profit being made across the lines of, we do use percentage, we do use absolute, but we do typically look at it in terms of the value being provided in alternative cost. And if we can allow people to move away from complete isolation, I think it has some value, and $40 to charge for this does not look particularly high to me. Although if you kind of spread it across the entire globe, 40 million.
Ryan, let me ask you another question, because you're actually you're thinking about it almost from a citizen's perspective.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about it as an investor or an analyst, what would fair profit mean that would, you think, create enough incentive for the next round of innovation, the next round of research and risk taking? If we're going to assign a fair profit cap to the top of a research and development cost, and we might want 2 or 3 more years of people really plowing their capital and intention into this, what would be the sweet spot there, where we're not paying too much on top of the cost, but we're doing enough to get it? How would Wall Street think through that?
You asked me to run you're running around an Excel spreadsheet in my head on the spot. So, bear with me, because people are going to, and please, people on the phone, don't jump on me afterwards. These numbers are not easily calculated. So I would probably argue that if you're going to run an R&D plus a manufacturing platform for vaccines, you're probably looking at $500 million, maybe a little bit more investment per year. And Randy, I'm hoping you have better numbers than me. And you probably have to assume that you'll be running it for 10 years on an ongoing basis to have something like that. So it's not going to be the only drug you develop, but you kind of want to have, I think, at least on at risk, maybe a 10%, 15% discounted rate on top of that. And those will probably be the numbers that I will start with. So I think a profit pool, I'm kind of throwing out there, profit pool of 5 to 10 billion, and I'm doing it just because you asked me for the number. 5 to 10 billion as a profit pool will probably be reasonable versus other markets in terms of the value of the market we'd expect from to be attractive. If you look at other vaccine markets that have been successful, you kind of look at kind of like under 10 billion, probably over 1 or 2 in terms of the attractiveness of the offer they provide.
Okay, thanks. Actually, Randy, I was going to circle to you next, but I'm going to go the other direction, if you don't mind. We'll get around to you again for sure. So Afton and Aaron, I'm almost asking you guys this question together. So Afton, I'm assuming that in some future world, I don't think it's part of your legislation, but you could imagine some commission is determined to identify these costs of production and a fair profit to serve as some kind of voice in this negotiation. You want transparency around the data, but ultimately you might want some group to take a look at that to make some of these decisions or judgments around fair profit on top of cost. And a person like Aaron could be an easily conceived chairman of this group, outside, independent, academic. So the two of you are working in a back room somewhere trying to cook this up. What's it look like? Aaron, how are you going to calculate the cost of production? Let's assume that there is a higher pay grade that might have to figure out what a fair profit is or other things. But the two of you, how would you think of putting it together? Would you try to include the longer term costs going back 10 years? How would you include the cost if the company were bought, a small company bought by a larger company? How would you try to put together a group that could kind of somehow make sense of all of those costs? How do you think, if you had a first draft of 1.0, what would it look like? Aaron, maybe I'll start with you, and then Afton can tell you how you should do it instead.
Well, I think this is a really good question. I think that it's important to recognize that the process of doing this is, from my mind at least, intended to put context onto the price of the product, and that the value of the product should be the sort of most important factor in what that product is. But then the investment that it might have taken to get that value, I think, is important context to try to understand if that value or if that price is fair. And I think that if you're looking, I think that you're going to want to look at, you're going to definitely want to look at cost of failure. I think that that's an important issue. Randy mentioned that. And I think you're going to want to look at the direct investments that led to the process by which this product was developed. I think that the point of having such a look back would be to try to determine what is too far back, what is too far tangential, and what, if you were organizing today to look forward to develop a plan to generate the hepatitis C drugs in the future, what kinds of input would you need? And I think that those are some of the parameters that you'd want to take into account.
Afton, any thoughts? Who would you want on this commission? How would you, because to a certain
You've
extent,
already named him. I was going to say Aaron. I was going to say we don't have a commission unless Aaron is running it. I have frequently said if we're going to have a drug pricing czar, it needs to be Aaron Kesselheim. I want him determining the world's drug prices. I have a lot of confidence in what he has to say and the way he thinks about this. And I think that he described the types of factors that you would want to consider. And I think that they were fair. He talked about including a risk factor. What exactly the risk factor is would be subject to debate. But, I think the fact that you would account for that, and you would account for the costs that went into this, and you would account for the value, those are all important topics. But I also trust that somebody like Aaron, if he was running this commission, and if I was designing the commission, which sounds very reminiscent of the list of factors that we have in Congressman Doggett's price negotiation bill of what should be factored into a fair price. We didn't set up a commission to determine it, but we have these same sorts of factors built in there. In addition to the value, we also look at what is the impact of price on patient access and being able to meet the global need. And I think that that is another really important point. What is the impact of the federal investment in this drug? Also, the federal government's not the only one that's investing in drug development. We've got a lot of private foundations that have been putting billions of dollars into COVID in particular, but also in other drugs that they've historically been investing in this. And so looking at the sources of investment is also going to be important. I don't think that a pharmaceutical company their price should benefit from an R&D investment made by somebody else. And I would say that them acquiring a smaller company's technology, it's that company that initially took that risk. And so I would not heavily weigh how much they spent to acquire that.
all right.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. I think just to sort of say, just to emphasize that last point, the price of that our acquisitions are made based on the possibility for profit in a very broken U.S. pharmaceutical pricing market, and not really based on the cost of developing a product. And so, the cost of acquisition is, to me, not a particularly interesting factor to take into account for that reason.
All right. We may have time or may not, but I just want to note that David slipped in something in his discussion about the factors. He was, obviously you've thought about this well, because there's the kind of logical problem if you've got a first drug at a certain effectiveness and its cost of production, so you've set a price somehow related to that, and you get a second drug that's much more effective, but for whatever reason is less expensive to make. A pure cost recovery approach would say that you should charge less for that drug, even though it's more effective, to keep the profit level, if you will, the fair profit level, the same for the company. And some people feel that that's probably, again, among the potentially counterintuitive incentives that you would send the market. You would actually, if it's a percent basis fair profit, you would send them after more expensive drugs, and it wouldn't matter how effective it is. They would just want a more effective drug, full stop, because their fair profit on top of that cost would get them more revenue. So lots of details. Randy, so this your industry has talked a lot about the problems of transparency in the drug delivery chain, the problems as the prices move from PBMs, from wholesalers through PBMs, and making very strong calls for transparency. You've heard others today say what we also need is transparency around these R&D costs. They are absolutely impossible to find, inscrutable. When asked, the companies kind of honestly throw up their hands and say, we wouldn't even know how to if asked. But I have a lot of confidence in the ingenuity of the pharmaceutical industry, and I bet they could come up with a way to consistently measure the R&D cost as a component of the development of a drug. Do you think that that's a fair ask, that we should at least be expecting the industry to provide that information, whether it's used as a ceiling or just a component of the way that the public thinks about pricing in a pandemic? What's the downside of asking the industry to put those data out?
I think that the discussion we've already had sort of exposes the downside, which is we haven't really figured it out. It's actually really complex and multifactored. It can't be isolated to one company, but extends across the ecosystem that is the engine of drug discovery and development in the US. And so there's a really good chance we're going to get it pretty wrong. And that as a result, we're going to send the wrong kinds of signals for incentives for future discovery. So I think that's the main issue. I think I'm confident in the environment focused on COVID-19 and the emergency we're in. I think we're going to look back in a year and find out that that wasn't really necessary there. I appreciate, I think this is perfectly valid to raise these questions, but I think we're going to look back in a year and find it wasn't really necessary because companies actually did mean it when they said they were committed to affordability. And they're going to deliver this because their focus really isn't on profit margin right now in this context. It's on affordability. Now, companies have to stay in business, but the reason they can do what they're doing right now is because we have a competitive market-driven system in the US. I think every other country where you have the kind of board at a national level to set pricing or coverage decisions, every other place you look, there's much worse access, in some cases worse patient outcomes, and certainly significant flight of research and development, primarily to US, which is one of the reasons we're the global leader in R&D. So I think it's not the road to go down, and I think we'll find at the end of the day we don't need to go down it.
Well, I certainly know that all of you hope that, at least in the setting of a pandemic, that issues of access are pretty much universally sorted one way or another. So my guess is that we won't see that much of a difference in access across countries. If we do, it's a failure on all of our heads. We have about... Can I add one super quick thing? I am fully with you on transparency around clinical and economic value. And I think our sector does dollar for dollar more than any other sector out there to deliver that transparency. That's partly what makes our competitive system work. But sorry, thanks, Steve. That's okay. All right, 15 minutes left. These 90 minutes, where do they go? So what I'd love to do is to not completely frustrate the large audience that has been sending in Q&As, but I will also tee each of you up to know that we're going to close the webinar by each of you having a final chance to make a statement. And so if we have time, I'll also allow a question from you guys. But Sarah, would you like to go ahead and start us off with a question or two from the audience?
Absolutely. And thank you to the audience for all of these great questions. One that's come up a few times is really in the weeds of the cost recovery model. And several attendees have said, but how do we talk about and incorporate opportunity cost? For the failures that will happen inevitably, do we then pay company A who had a failed trial, but they discovered a new mechanism of action that company B was able to do successfully? Does the panel have a reaction to incorporating opportunity cost into a cost recovery model?
Not sure who's best set to give a shot at that one. Aaron, maybe I'll look to you first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I mentioned this briefly in my comments before, but I do think that including, an understanding that that there is cost that there is cost of failure, and that not every investment then directly leads to the outcome is important. So I think that is an important factor to consider when you're looking at the cost of production. And so again, I think this is something this is where some of the transparency and insights that Afton and David were talking about are necessary, because you need to kind of look at, what were the different options, how much was invested in those different options, and try to figure out how those should be considered. I think that it's not necessarily, I think that you can go overboard in that, and that just because a company invested a lot of money in a lot of different, unrealistic options, shouldn't necessarily be considered. But I think this is the challenge of this model. But I think that it's also something that, greater insights into what's going on can help provide some guidance around, and provide at least some, a ballpark for what we should be considering.
That's great. Sarah, actually, just a real quick, some people, when they raise the question of opportunity cost and thinking about cost recovery, some people will be thinking about from the company's perspective, the opportunity cost of putting money into a drug development pathway that's going to lead to a cost plus return, as opposed to a drug that might be for a different condition where they could make higher profits. So from a company's perspective, there's an opportunity cost of putting time, energy, and capital into one track as opposed to the other. So and some people have felt that that's why if you use a cost recovery and it's too low as far as the return, it will actually drive them into the next hair tonic or whatever else it is that they could make more money on. All right, Sarah, keep going.
Is it logical for COVID patients to overpay, or I will add, really the system to overpay on behalf of COVID patients, so that the companies can then invest that money in curing other diseases?
Okay, I get to pick who answers that one. I tell you what, Randy.
I don't think we're asking anyone to overpay. I think we have to bring good evidence to bear in order to get FDA approval. And then, as I said, continue to develop better evidence after new treatments and vaccines are introduced. And that'll help give us a handle on what the role is of those treatments. But I think what we're looking for in the context of COVID-19 is just to ensure that those medicines are being made available at a cost that ensures affordability to health systems and taxpayers. I think, Sarah, to your point, I think there's pretty complete protection at the patient level, where I think we can have assurance that patients won't face unaffordability problems in the pandemic. But we are also committed to ensuring that those treatments and vaccines will meet the goal of affordability at the system and societal level as well.
Thanks. Sarah, go ahead.
So if we're going to take a cost recovery approach, do we need to rethink it entirely if COVID-19 becomes the seasonal flu and is not something that we're dealing with on this immediate scale?
David, what do you think? All right, you're muted now. David, did you hear the question?
I didn't hear the question. Sarah broke up.
Sarah, say it again.
Absolutely. If we're going to do cost recovery for COVID-19, do we have to rethink that approach if COVID becomes something like the seasonal flu and not an immediate public health emergency?
Yeah, I think we do rethink the pricing. You know, if you make and distribute 1 billion doses, what happens to your marginal cost if you need to actually have 2 billion doses because it has to be given repeatedly? The cost, per unit cost comes down dramatically. And so I think that you would, as the government, especially if the government is a purchaser of these bulk amounts, the government would look at lowering the price, because the per unit cost would go down tremendously. And the idea of paying, $20 on a $10 cost, $20 retail on a $10 cost to make it, versus $20 cost or price on a $5 cost to make it, because we're spreading it over a bigger number of doses, yeah, I think you'd have to renegotiate.
So if I can jump on this, if I can jump into this one, 2 quick points here. First, we are talking here about the difference between $10 and $20, right? So I don't know, in the grand scheme of things, I don't know how much it matters. But more importantly, once you pass the next 12 months or 18 months, we will probably be in an opposite situation where there'll be an oversupply of vaccine makers who have developed vaccines and therapies for this market, and we're able to scale up their manufacturing. So, I completely agree that the pricing should be different if you're talking about an acute disease that then disappears versus something that stays there for longer, and companies that have longer period to recover their profits. I would actually, the way we model it, we assume the profits from that market largely go away by 2022, because when we go to a demand-constrained environment from a supply-constrained environment, just because that's what we've seen with other vaccines, profits go down to the marginal cost, just because there's typically an oversupply of those vaccines versus the demand in the market.
By the way, Ronnie, I'd love it if that happened. If we had 5 different equally effective vaccines and they were competing with one another. That's not the way drugs work in the United States of America. People are given monopolies and then they exercise monopoly pricing. I'd love to have a free market with multiple competitors with effective vaccines, because then a competitive market could impose the discipline that we're trying to talk about, a cost recovery model or whatever you want to call it, imposing. And by the way, Ronnie, you keep saying it's only $5, it's only $10. Let's talk about that when you multiply it by billions of people on the planet. That's a lot of money, Ronnie. And if we want to use a benchmark, let's go back to 2009. The H1N1 vaccine was purchased by the government for $8 a dose. Pfizer came forward with a price that was more than double that amount. Even if I increased that $8 to $9.60 to account for inflation during the intervening 11 years, since 2009, we're still paying double the price that we did in 2009. $10, double the price, more. That's not a little bit of money on billions of doses, Ronnie. It's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money for people who need that to, for instance, re-engineer their schools so our kids can go back to school. But you want us to send it to pharma.
All right, hold on.
Give me a chance to respond to that.
Hold on.
Well,
right.
And I'll be kind about it.
We're getting to final comments, and then you guys can choose your.
No, Ronnie deserves a shot back.
David, hold on. Okay, I'm going to say something quickly, and then we're going to move to final comments. That is just to say that question was excellent on multiple levels. One of which is just to point out again that none of these pricing approaches that are part of our white paper, part of these webinars, are mutually exclusive, and many of them can be used in 2 steps. And so even when we were talking not about a vaccine, but about remdesivir, we imagined a hypothetical cost recovery approach in which Gilead would get back its R&D costs in the first year, and then the price would drop lower to a more kind of cost recovery at just the marginal cost of production, but that there would be a shorter phase where the research costs were also returned, because you never really, we do not know, none of us obviously know what's going to happen years 2, 3, 4. And I do know that it's greatly complicating the plans of companies that are trying to figure out what to do with investments in vaccines, in treatments, when you cannot tell in 3 years if you're going to have 1 billion people or 0 people needing your treatment. So with that, and I get the prerogative because, yes, I'm the moderator. I'm standing next to the lady with the sword. Be careful. So we've got about 5 minutes left. That means if you could please do a 1-sentence closing statement. You are all Miltonian, Shakespearean experts who could probably give a sentence that would last 5 minutes. But if you could please just make it 1 sentence, please leave the audience with what you think is the most important takeaway point that you think, again, this discussion, this issue needs to have as a headline as policymakers like Afton and others continue to wrestle with it. Here I will start. We'll go probably again in the same order we did the comments. I'll start with Aaron. A kind of a final statement. Anything you'd like to add? 1 minute or less, please.
I would say that I think that this conversation is very important, and I think that thinking about what we really should be thinking about is the best way of trying to get the vaccines and medications that we need out there, and not about the best way of trying to sort of incentivize pharmaceutical manufacturers. That doesn't seem, that it seems like and I think that the cost recovery approach is a good prospective way of doing that, semicolon. So what we really need, I think, is work from people like Afton and from people who are listening to this to speak to their representatives, because I think that we really need to have ground rules and plans set ahead of time, and not rely on the statements and of individual manufacturers, which we're not going to be able to hold them accountable, as we saw in the case of Gilead and remdesivir, which is priced at the maximum amount that they can extract under the this so-called value-based notion. So I think that this is an important thing to work out, and I hope that we can I hope that we can come together with our policymakers to try to figure this out prospectively, because that's the best time to do it! !
Thank you. Ronnie, you were next.
So again, appreciate Steve and ICER in creating this environment. I think it's an important early discussion for a debate we're likely to have post the coming November election about how we're going to design or change the design of the drug industry. Specifically, though, for this epidemic, I will kind of repeat the point I was making through, which is I'm not so sure we have a problem. The cost being charged by the drug industry here in this particular case is not high versus other drug markets. Creating an exception here and trying to impose something in the middle of the epidemic is probably a lot more risky and not quite worth it. And I would encourage David to look a little bit at the pricing of vaccines in the United States of the world. As a matter of fact, out of all the drug markets, vaccines are probably the most egalitarian, highest value. And if you look at international pricing of vaccines, they are essentially in the emerging market at cost. We're talking about a cost of $20 for the US and not for countries that cannot afford it. So,
okay, thanks, Ronnie. I'm going to shift. I need to make sure that everybody gets in before 1:30. So, David, and you lost your semicolon. You get a comma at most, David.
I want to acknowledge what Ronnie said about vaccine prices being egalitarian, more so than many other drugs around the world. I would just say one more thing as we close. I don't think it's fair for drug companies to try to recoup all the savings that may be accrued from a new vaccine or a new treatment. The idea that we not only give them all the money that was saved by getting someone out of the hospital earlier, or all the productive life years that person gains, nobody else in our healthcare system is paid that way. And the nurse team or the doctor team that gets someone out of the hospital in 3 days instead of 10 with COVID-19 is not getting a huge bonus in that savings that pharma wants all for itself. And value pricing is very relevant to this discussion, but not with an industry that wants to grab every single dollar that's saved and say it belongs to me, because no one else gets that.
Okay.
I'm going to level an objection on that point.
All right. A great advert for next week, Randy.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks everyone again. I think one thing we've heard today is that the unpredictability is extreme in the environment we're in, and the rapid changes we're going to see in patient care pathways in the months ahead and the rapid changes in epidemiology make it almost impossible to accurately and appropriately implement a cost recovery model, but I would say we don't need to, and we're going to find we don't need to, because companies are going to make good on their commitments to affordability, and I'm happy to get back together with all of you in a year and see how we've done.
I'll keep you to that. Afton, thank you very much, Randy. Afton.
Randy, I have a solution to your we don't know how to determine the R&D cost problem. All of your members have accounting departments. I think you can just show us the balance sheets. And Ronnie, you said that COVID prices are not high compared to other drug markets, so we're doing all right. you're right, but the system was failing us before and it's failing us right now, and we need genuine reform.
All right, with that, I would really like to thank our speakers very, very much. I'm going to quickly step back just to share a screen here with their names again. And with that, I'd like to just to note that a recording of this webinar will be available on the ICER website in approximately a week. We want to thank all of the participants today, including those on the phone. We're sorry we couldn't get to very many of your questions. We know that many of them were outstanding, and we hope that you will continue this conversation because the issues are raw, the need is high. You know, we haven't really talked enough about how desperately important this is, not just to policymakers, but to patients and to our healthcare systems and to our entire country to figure this out and get it right. So with that, we know this is the beginning of a series of discussions that we're going to have, and we hope that we've provided you with some further information to guide your own decisions and your own conversations going forward. Thank you, everybody, very, very much, and we hope to have you on next week's call, Friday at 12 p.m., in which we'll be talking about cost effectiveness and value-based pricing as an approach to pricing in a pandemic. Thank you, everybody.